Okay, good morning, everybody. We're on DAF Kuf Beis Amud Aleph at the Mishnah. And let us begin. Hazorek. If a person throws a projectile, and he's throwing this in Rishus Harabim, V'nizkar me'achar sheyatzasa miyado, and he remembers after the projectile has left his hand. So we learned before that this is he's no longer a shogeg. At this moment, he's no longer a shogeg because he realizes, hey, it's Shabbos, I'm not supposed to be doing this. But he can't. But the problem is he's already released the projectile. So the Mishnah then says, Kolta acher, kolta kelevo shenisrafa, if instead of the object landing on the ground, it is caught by someone else, or a dog catches it in its mouth, or it incinerates before it hits the ground, so then you're going to be potter. Now, what the Gemara is going to infer from this is something a little bit problematic, because really, it would seem that even if it hits the ground, you should be potter, since by the time it hits the ground, you're no longer a shogeg. But the Mishnah doesn't say that. The Mishnah says that the only way that you're going to be potter is if it doesn't hit the ground in a normative way. Why should that be? Even if it hits the ground in a normative way, you're no longer a shogeg, so you should be potter from a korban. That's really the question that the Gemara is going to ask, and we're going to analyze that over the next few lines. But let's finish the Mishnah first. Zara klasos chabura bein ba'adam uvein ba'behema. If a person throws an object in order to injure someone, we'll create a fanciful case. Let's say you have a hypodermic needle, and you want to throw it across the room in order to hit a bullseye on the guy, right? So, because otherwise, why would a person want to injure someone else, right? So maybe you want to do it for therapeutic reasons. But the point is that even for therapy, it's usher to injure, to draw blood. It's usher to create a chabura, to create an injury on someone's body on Shabbos. And therefore, v'nizkarat shalonasis chabura, if you remember after you've already released the hypodermic needle and it's flying in midair and it's about to hit him, so then you're going to be potter, because by the time it hits him, you're no longer a shogeg. So therefore, when we say potter, we mean that you're exempt from bringing a korban chatas. Why? Because ze'ah klal, because the general rule is like this: kol chayave chataos einon chayavin ashay tchilasen v'sofen shkaga. Because you can't be chayav a korban chatas unless the beginning of the act and the end of the act were in a state of mind where you're a shogeg. But if by the time that the end of the act is completed, you're no longer a shogeg because you become aware, so then, and like that's what the Mishnah says, tchilasen shkaga v'sofen zadan, or tchilasen zadan v'sofen shkaga v'turin. If you start off as a shogeg, but then you have awareness in the middle, and so that by the time the act is finished, you're no longer a shogeg, or vice versa, you started off b'mezid and you ended off as a shogeg, so in both of those cases you're going to be potter. Ad shetei tchilasen v'sofen shkaga, both the beginning and the end have to be b'shogeg. What about the middle? That too will be discussed by the Gemara. What if the beginning and the end are shogeg and the middle is b'mezid? That we'll discuss momentarily. But let's first go back to our original question. What's bothersome to the Gemara is hanacha chayav, that from the first line of the Mishnah, the first case, it seems like the only time that you're going to be potter, if you become aware while the projectile is in midair, is if it doesn't land normatively on the ground, but instead lands in a dog's mouth or in your friend's hand or incinerates, right? But if it does hit the ground, it sounds like you're going to be chayav. V'halo nizkar utanan kol chayav echatos inen chayav anashet tchilasen v'sofen shkaga. But if you become aware while it's in the midair, didn't we just learn at the end of the Mishnah that you're not going to be chayav a korban chatos unless both the beginning and the end of the act are shogeg? So Amar of Kahana Seifa Asan L'Lechta Umasna. So Rav Kahana gives an answer which really, he says a specific example, but what he really means to say is as follows. Lechta Umasna is a certain kind of clasping apparatus that is basically a rope that's attached to a clasp at the end that you use in order to attach wine flasks to the underbelly of your donkey when you're traveling. And basically you have a rope, and at the end of the rope is a clasp made out of wood. The idea that what he's trying to convey is as follows. The only time that we say that when you end off the act, if you're no longer a shogeg, you're going to be potter from a korban chatas, is if you're still in control of the system. But if you're no longer in control of the system because you've released the object and now through inertia it is traveling through the air and you no longer can control its motion, so then even if you become aware while it's flying in midair, you're still going to be chayiv the korban chatas when it hits the ground. Because why? Because by the time you came to the realization, you were no longer part of the system. You were no longer part of that projectile. The only time when the Mishnah says the zeh klal, this general rule that if you become aware in the middle that you're off the hook for a chatas, is only when you're still attached and in control of what's going on. So, for example, if I throw an object and that object is connected to a rope, such that when I become aware as it's flying through midair, I say, hey, I'm not supposed to be throwing this on Shabbos, so you yank the rope to abort the projectile's motion, that's where we say that you're off the hook for a korban chatas, because if you allow the projectile to continue traveling, then it's within your purview to do so, and therefore you're clearly amazed when it continues traveling and ends up on the ground. And therefore we say, look, since half of your act was b'shogeg and half your act was b'mezid, then you're not chayiv a korban chatas, because you're only chayiv a korban chatas when you're totally a shogeg. But when you release a projectile, so even though you become aware in the middle, but since you couldn't stop it, you can't abort it, you're still called a shogeg through and through, and therefore you will be chayiv a korban chatas if it hits the ground. Am I making myself, I hope I'm making it clear. I hope I'm not making it more complicated. So the Gemara now says, but wait a minute. Lechta umasna ogdo biyodo. But wait a minute. If you're telling me that we're talking about a guy in the end of the Mishnah who's throwing a projectile that's attached to a rope, then you're never going to be chayiv, even if you're totally shogeg. You know why? Because when you throw a projectile that's attached to a rope, that's not called throwing. We had established this before, that you're only chayiv for a zrika when it's an independently traveling projectile. But if you're still attached to it, that's not called throwing, for which you're going to be chayiv for doing a malacha. That's not even called a malacha because it's still attached to you. So the Gemara answers, you're right. Kigon sheniskavin lasos chabura. The zeh klal that the Mishnah says, that you're going to be patur, you're going to be off the hook for a korban because the last part of it was mazid, is not talking about throwing. It's not talking about throwing dalet amos and rishus harabim. It's talking about making a chabura, where you're throwing the hypodermic needle to hit the guy at the other end of the room, but in order to make it even more fanciful, the hypodermic needle is attached to a rope, and you release it, and all of a sudden you realize, while the hypodermic needle is in the middle of the room, flying through the air, hey, I'm not supposed to make a chabura on Shabbos. So you can theoretically, you could yank the rope to stop the motion of the needle, and you choose not to. And therefore, the rest of the way that it's traveling is amazing, because you had the power to stop it, and you chose not to stop it. So that's where we say that you're off the hook, because you've done a malacha of chabura, but part of it was mazid and part of it was shogeg, so therefore there is no korban. Okay? So the Gemara says, but wait a minute. Hanami tanina, hazorik lasos chabura, bein ba'adam, bein ba'behema, v'nizkar ad shelo na'ases chabura pater. But 1 second, says the Gemara, that also was explicitly addressed by the Mishnah. So if it was explicitly addressed by the Mishnah, the case of chabura, why would you limit the principle of zeh klal only to that one case? That doesn't seem to make any sense, right? And therefore, it must be that the zeh klal must be coming to tell you something else other than what is explicitly addressed in the Mishnah. And since the case of chabura, throwing an object to make a chabura, is explicitly addressed in the Mishnah, the zeh klal can't only be addressing that. So Ella Amar Rava b'ma'avir. But rather, says Rava, you know what zeh klal is coming to address? A person who's carrying an object in rishus harabim, not a person who's throwing, or not a person who's throwing in order to make a chabura, but a person who's carrying an apple on Shabbos outside in his hand, and he's carrying it 4 amos. After he carries it only 2 amos, he realizes, hey, it's Shabbos, I'm not supposed to be doing this. There, the Mishnah says that if you choose to carry it another 2 amos, you've done a malacha, but you're not totally a shogeg, and therefore you can't bring a korban chatas. But wait a minute, v'hazeh klal de katani azrika katani. But the Gemara says, but wait a minute, the zeh klal of our Mishnah is coming to modify and in some way augment the previous two statements. The previous two statements were talking about throwing an object, either to make you chayev for something traveling for amos and reshus harabim, or for creating a chabura. How can you then turn around and say that zeh haklal that comes immediately after them is not talking about zrika, it's not talking about throwing, but talking about carrying? That would be completely inconsistent with the style of the Mishnah. So Ela Omar Rava Tarte Katani. So Rava says, here's the real answer. The real answer is that no. In reality, even after you release a projectile, if you become aware that this is Asr on Shabbos, then in reality, even when it hits the ground, you're going to be potter. Why does the Mishnah say that only if someone else catches it, you're going to be potter? Because really you have to bisect the statement of the Mishnah and read it as two separate cases. You read it as follows. Hazorek v'nizkar, that if you throw a projectile and then while it's flying in the air you realize that it's Shabbos, me'achar shiyatza samiyado inami lo nizkar v'kolta achar kolta kelavos v'nisrafa. Or, case number 2, you release a projectile and you're totally shogeg through and through, and if it doesn't land on the ground because a dog caught it in its mouth, or the other cases, or someone else caught it or incinerated, in all of those cases you're going to be patur. So therefore, the way that Rava reads the Mishnah is a little bit of it's an unusual way of reading the Mishnah, but he says, but that's what the Mishnah means. The Mishnah is really addressing two different cases. One case is where you release it and it hits the ground, but you realized in midair that this is asr, so therefore you're no longer a shogeg. So that's one case where you'll be patur. And case number 2 where you're going to be patur is if you throw it and it doesn't land on the ground because something else interrupted its path and it got caught by something else in midair. So there too you're going to be patur.
They didn't realize it was asr?
Yeah, the whole time. In case B, the whole time you're a shogeg. Rav Ashi gives a similar teretz, but slightly more satisfying in the language of the Mishnah. And he says, that really there's a little piece of the Mishnah missing, and you have to read it as follows. If you throw a projectile, and while it's, after you've already released it, and it's flying in the air, you realize that it's Shabbos, then in that scenario, if it doesn't hit the ground because something else caught it before it could hit the ground, so then you're going to be potter. Hanacha chayiv, and if it hits the ground, you're going to be chayiv. But when is that true? Bamedvar mamurim shechazer v'shachach. If after you realize, hey, it's Shabbos, I'm not supposed to be doing this, you then again forgot again. Now, what does this guy have? Retrograde amnesia? What's going on over here? So the thing that I'm thinking is like this. What I'm thinking of is that a guy realizes it's Shabbos, but he thinks that it's permitted to throw in this area because he thinks that it's a Rishus HaYachid. So he releases it, thinking that it's a Rishus HaYachid, and then all of a sudden he looks around and says, wait a minute, I think this is a Rishus HaRabim. And then he says, nah, it's a Rishus HaYachid. And then it hits the ground. And so then someone comes over to him and says, no, it really is a Rishus HaRabim. And what you did was a malacha. So since the beginning of his releasing was b'shogeg, and when it hit the ground he was a shogeg, he's going to be chayev a korban chatos. Avolo chazer v'shachach poter. But if, when he released it, he thought it was a reshus hayachid, and then he comes to the realization that it's a reshus harabim, and he doesn't re-forget, and he continues realizing that it's a reshus harabim by the time that it hits the ground, so there you're going to be poter from a korban chatos. Because the only time you can be chayav a korban chatas is if both the beginning and the end of the act are b'shogeg, where your state of mind is shogeg. And that's what the Mishnah ends with, that the general rule is that as long as the beginning and end are shogeg, you're chayav a korban chatas. Itmar. Now the following statement was made. Shtei amos b'shogeg, shtei amos b'mezid, shtei amos b'shogeg. A guy's carrying something. The first 2 amos that he's traveling he doesn't realize it's Shabbos. Second 2 amos, he realizes it's Shabbos. And then he walks another 2 amos without realizing it's Shabbos. So in other words, he's carrying something. First 2 amos he's unaware. Second 2 amos he is aware. Last 2 amos, to make a total of 6, he's unaware. So here there's a machlokus. Rabba Amar Potter, Rabba Amar Chayiv. So Rabba says you're Potter, and Rava says you're going to be Chayiv. Now Rabba Amar Potter, Rabba says, you know why you're Potter? Why you can't bring a korban chatas in this case, even though the beginning and end of your act was shogeg. Why? Because, and afilu l'Rabban Gamliel da Amar ein yediyah l'chatzi shir. And the reason why you're going to be Potter over here is true even according to Rabban Gamliel. Now there's a machlokas between Rabban Gamliel and the Chachamim elsewhere. And the machlokas is as follows. What if I'm eating a kazayas of chaylev, for forbidden fat, and in the middle, after I eat my first half a kazayas, I say to myself, hey, I think this is chaylev. And then I say, nah, it's not chaylev, and I eat the other half a kazayas. Right? So according to Rabban Gamliel, that awareness in the middle does not stop a conjunction of the 2 half a kazasim. And according to Rabban Gamliel, you're going to be chayiv a korban chatas because you ate a full kazayas of chaylev b'shogeg. Even though you had an awareness in the middle, nevertheless, you're still going to be chayiv. And why then over here would I, Rabbi, say that you're pater? Because hasamu dechi kagamar shiur b'shogeg kagamar aval hacha de b'mezid lo. Because it's very simple, he says. In the case of Rabban Gamliel, by your awareness that what you're doing is usher takes place before you ate a requisite amount for which you would be chayiv. But in the case of Shabbos, where you're carrying an object, when does your awareness take place? While you're carrying the object, the Amma 3 and Amma 4. By the time you hit Amma 4, you have carried an object, a requisite shear of 4 amos in order to make you chayiv. And at that moment, you have awareness that what you're doing is aser. So therefore, explains Rabbah, since your awareness coincides with the completion of a forbidden act, it's at a time when you're b'mezid and no longer b'shogeg, we can't obligate you to bring a korban. You don't bring a korban in that case. In the case of chaylev, your awareness came before you had completed the requisite amount. And therefore, that knowledge does not stop you from conjoining with the shogeg that comes afterwards. But over here, with your carrying, since you've carried with awareness 4 amos, at that moment when you've carried 4 amos, you're aware at that point, so then game over, and we can't make you chayiv a korban chatas, even if you carry another 2 amos b'shogeg.
By the chaylev, you finish b'shogeg, is that the idea?
In the case of the carrying, you carry 6 amos.
Right.
So the last 2 amos of those 6, you're shogeg. But by the time you carried 4 amos, at that moment that you carried 4 amos, you're aware at that point. So you've already completed a shear of carrying. And at that moment when you've completed a shear of carrying, you're amazed.
So you'd be pater.
So therefore, you're going to be pater from a korban chatas. By the chaylev, your awareness takes place before you've eaten the shear of a kazayas. And therefore, that knowledge does not interrupt the half a kazayas before and the half of the kazayas after. Mm-hmm. Here, the 2 amos before of shogeg and the 2 amos after of shogeg are interrupted by 2 amos of mezid, but at that moment when that interruption takes place, you've completed the shear of dalet amos. You see the difference? It's a very, very subtle difference, but it's a very important conceptual difference.
A proper analogy would be, let's say he would have remembered instead of on the second amma after he walked the first amma, and you had the separation by 3 instead of 4?
Yes, correct. So now the Gemara says, Uvamai. What case is Rabbah addressing where he says you're going to be off the hook for a korban? He says, Ibizoreg shogegu. If you've released the projectile and it's no longer in your hands and it's flying through the air, that can't be what Rabbah is saying, because your awareness is not, there's no hanacha at the time of your awareness. So therefore, your awareness does not coincide with the completion of a forbidden act. So therefore, Ella what? Ella b'ma'avir. he must be talking about when you're carrying. So since you're carrying those 2 amos in the middle of awareness, and you've carried 4 amos, so then that's what he must be talking about. Rava Amar Chayiv Afilu L'Rabbanan Da'amar Yesh Yediyah L'Chatzi Shir. He says Rava, by contrast, says that you're going to be Chayiv. Now, Rava says that this is true even according to the Rabbanan who argue with Rabbi Gamliel. And in the case of eating chaylev, they hold that since you had awareness after you ate a half a kazayas, you do not conjoin the first half a kazayas to the second half a kazayas, and they say that in that case you're going to be off the hook for a korban when you eat a kazayas chaylev with awareness in between. But he says there, hasamhu de biyado, because in that scenario, since you're in the middle of eating and you've got the piece of chaylev in your hand, you can stop yourself from eating again another half a kazayas, and therefore, since you're in complete control of the situation, your awareness separates between the first half a kazayas and the second half a kazayas. Aval hacha de'ein biyado lo. But over here, where you're releasing a projectile in the air, since your awareness will not, does not, at the time when you become aware that you're doing a malacha, you can no longer control the situation. So then, as long as when it lands, you're a shogeg again, you're going to be chayiv. So uvamai ibamavi hare biyado. So Rava can't be talking about the same case as Rabba. Rabba was talking about carrying, but in the case of carrying, it is biyado. It is within his control to stop at that point. So Rava must be talking about a case of throwing, ela b'zorek. So therefore Rashi says, like Rashi clarifies, what the Gemara is essentially saying is, Rabba and Rava are not arguing with each other. It's not a machlokus over here. They're mar omar chada, umar omar chada, velo plige. They're saying 2 different halachas that have nothing, but really they don't argue. In a case of throwing, since your awareness takes place at a time where you're not in control of the situation, and by the time it hits the ground, you're a shogeg again, so we don't reckon with that knowledge in the middle, and therefore you're going to be chayav a korban chatas, because it started b'shogeg and it ended with shogeg. But in a situation where the object, you're carrying the object, not that it's flying through the air, and by the time you carry 4 amos, that's at a juncture where you have awareness, so there you're going to be patur according to everybody, because it's biyado, because you have the ability to interrupt the additional carrying. So because your mind is aligned with that stopping point where you can stop the situation, you've completed a shear of carrying, and therefore you're going to be off the hook, because this is half b'shogeg and half b'mezid. Amar Rabba. Now Rabba says, Zorak v'nocha b'fi ha'kelev o b'fi ha'kivshin chayiv. He makes an astounding statement, which at face value is a complete contradiction to our Mishnah. He says that if you throw a projectile and it lands in a dog's mouth, or it lands in an oven and it incinerates before it can actually complete its landing, so then you're going to be chayiv. You've done a malacha. But wait a minute. Didn't we say in our Mishnah that you're patur in those cases? Because it didn't land on the ground. Answers the Gemara. The distinction is very simple. When you threw an object in the air and a dog catches it, it was not your intention for the dog to catch it. But when you're in the park and you're throwing a frisbee, and you got your dog Rover right next to you, and you say, Rover, catch, so then it's clearly your intention for the dog to catch the frisbee, and that's called a hanacha. Even though normally a dog's mouth does not have the chashivas of being a makam hanacha, but the fact that you want it to land in the dog's mouth makes it a significant resting spot. So Amar Rav Bibi bar Abaya af ananomi tanina. We have a brisa to support this. Yesh ochel achila echas v'chayev aleha daled chatos v'asham echad. There's a brisa that says that a person could eat 1 kazayas of food, and for that 1 kazayas have to bring 4 karbonos chatos and 1 korban asham. What's the case? Hatame sha'achal chelev. A person is tameh, and he's eating a piece of chelev, a kazayas of chelev, v'hu nosar, which is sacrificial meat, v'hu nosar min ha'mukdashim. It is from sacrificial meat who's already past its expiration point. And he eats it on when? On Yom Kippur. So the 4 karbanos chatos that you have to bring is, number 1, you're eating an object in a state of, sacrificial object in a state of tumah. That's 1 korban chatos. Number 2, you're eating chelev. That's another korban chatos. Number 3, it's nosar. That's also korban chatos. And number 4, it's on Yom Kippur. That's 4 karbanos chatas. And what's the karban asham? For doing an act of me'ilah, for eating that which is kadshim, sacrificial for personal use, which is an asham me'ilos. And Reb Meir Omer, afim ha'isa Shabbos v'otziu b'fiv chayev. Reb Meir says, I can come up with another karban chatas, and that is that if, while it's in your mouth, you walk outside, you're going to be chayev in karban chatas because it's Shabbos. So Amrulo, eino min hashem. And the Chachamim say, we agree with you that you're chayev an additional karban chatas, but the reason we don't include that in the list is because there you're not chayev a karban chatas for eating, you're chayev a karban chatas for carrying. And carrying is not the same classification as eating. So the Gemara says, Va'amai, why should you ever be chayev for carrying by carrying something in your mouth? That's not the normative way of carrying. You normally carry something in your hand, not in your mouth. Answers the Gemara, because since you want it in your mouth, that's the place where you want it because you want to eat it while you're walking, therefore that becomes now an important place because it's deliberate on your behalf that you should be carrying it in your mouth. And therefore, anytime your mental designation says that that's where it belongs, then that's called a hanacha, that's called a chashava place. That's why chewing gum outside when there's no Eruv is problematic on Shabbos, because you're carrying the gum. You understand? Okay, so Hadron Allah Chazore. Okay, let's go on.
What, no, he threw it, the frisbee for the duck to catch it. What if the duck missed?
And it hits the ground. Oh. That's a great shaila. So you could argue that maybe since the hanacha took place in an unintended spot, you wouldn't be chayiv. That's a very good point. I don't know the answer whether halacha lamaisa that's true, but logic dictates that what you're saying is correct. Okay, let's go on to the next parak.
You're doing a mint, and that's to freshen your breath on Shabbos, and you go out the Eruv.
I think that's a problem. I think it's a very serious problem. I think it's a problem of hotzah. Okay, let's take a look at the next Mishnah. Habona kama yivna v'yehi chayiv. Now, this Mishnah is all about the laws of Bona. Tosfos isn't really clear why the laws of Bona come after the laws of Hotza'ah, but we'll leave that aside as an interesting question. Take a look at the Tosfos Yantif. But in any event, how much must a person build in order to be liable for the malacha of Bona, which is defined as construction? Now, there are 2 malachas out of the 39 which are very similar to each other. One is called Bona, which is construction, and the other one is called makeh bepatish, when you strike the final hammer blow to finalize a product. The 2 of them are very similar. Sometimes both apply, and sometimes only one of the 2 applies to a situation. And we're going to see that in our Gemara. But the Mishnah also combines them as well. So how much do you have to build to do bichai for an act of bona? Habona kolshu. So the answer is that even if you build the slightest amount. And furthermore, says the Mishnah, v'hamisates, if you square off a stone to prepare it for to be placed in a construction project, and misates, by the way, just means that you apply the final squaring off or the final grooving of the stone, depending upon what kind of construction project you're working on. Rashi says that in Germany, they used to make certain kinds of grooves in the stone. That was the style of construction. The hamake bepatish, or if a person makes the final hammer blow to finish a product. The example that's given is, let's say you're in a quarry and you're hewing stone from a mountain to harvest stone. Let's say the stone has been almost completely hewed, but there's one last final blow of the hammer that will dislodge the rock from the quarry. So that final hammer blow is called the malacha of makeh bepatish. Uvema'atzad, or if you use a pickaxe instead of a hammer, or v'hakodeach kolshu, or if you drill a hole, even a small hole in a construction project, in all of those cases you're going to be chayiv. Zeh haklal kol ha'osa malacha malachto miskayemes b'Shabbos chayiv. The general rule is that anytime you do a malacha, and the malacha endures, in other words, it has been fulfilled, what that means we have to define in the Gemara, then you're going to be chayiv. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Af hamaka b'kurnis al hasadan b'shas malacha chayiv mipnei shehu kemisakein malacha. That even if in between hammer blows in your construction project you bang the hammer on an anvil in between each hammer blow, that banging of the hammer on the anvil is also a malacha because it helps you complete your construction project. It helps you complete the project that you're working on. And how that works, the Gemara will also clarify, but apparently banging the hammer on the anvil either sharpens or refines the instrument that you're using in order to enable you to continue along with the project.
Well, what's an anvil?
It's a flat piece of metal that blacksmiths use in order to flatten the objects that they're working with.
So he strikes.
He's taking his tool,
yeah,
and in between each blow to his chisel work that he's doing, he bangs it on the anvil in order to flatten it and refine the instrument more.
Oh, for the instrument.
Yeah. Okay, so let's take a look now at the Gemara. Now, kol shehu l'may chazir. When you tell me that I'm chayiv even for the slightest little act of construction, well, what is the slight building? How is that considered significant if it can't be used for anything? So, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah shekin ani chofer gumel lahatzniya b'frutosav. He says because a poor person can dig a tiny little hole in the ground. That's an act of construction because he uses it to hide his coins. And dekavosa gabe mishkan shekin tofer yirios tofer gumel lahatzniya b'machteim. And this was done in the Mishkan too, because the women who would be stitching all of the needlework, they would hide their needles in the ground and they would dig a tiny little hole. So Amar Abaye, Kevin Demishtaki Lo Avdi Hachi, says no, you can't hide needles in the ground. Needles don't get hidden in the ground. If you put a needle in the ground, it's going to rust. So that was not done in the Mishkan. So Elo Shekain Ani Osa Pitpute Kira Kitana Lisvos Aleha Kedera Kitana. He says, really, the construction that we're talking about, the tiniest little thing, is like when you're a poor person and you only have a small amount to cook. So you make yourself a little makeshift tripod to put over a little fire, a small amount of coals. That's the kind of ad hoc construction that we're talking about that's very insignificant but still makes you liable. Why? Because the kavasa gabe mishkan mevashli saman lispo yirios shechasra malachtan osin pipute kira ketana lisvos aleha yora ketana. He says because this was done in the Mishkan as well. Many times, says Abaye, one of the things they did in the Mishkan is that they would dye wool. And when you dye wool, you have to make sure that for whatever amount of wool that you have a corresponding amount of dye. Well, sometimes they didn't align it exactly correctly, and you had only enough dye to dye, let's say, 95% of the wool, and there was a small amount of wool that remained undyed. So you wouldn't make a whole new batch of dye, right? That would be wasteful. And therefore, instead, you'd set up a little tiny pot on a makeshift tripod. It would be a tiny, tiny little thing, and you'd cook your dye on that little tripod. And that's why doing a small, insignificant act like that is still considered to be a malacha.
So does Gemara mention Der Hagav that's like was done in the Mishkan, or
no. It has to be that way.
Everything has to be related to the Mishkan.
It has to be related to the Mishkan in order for it to be defined as a malacha. So Rav Acha bar Yaakov Amar Enanios b'makam Ashira. So Rav Acha bar Yaakov says, what are you talking about? He says that's not what was done in the Mishkan. The Mishkan had extravagance and opulence in its manufacture. There never was a situation where they would run out of dye. They always made a surplus of everything. So there was never a problem of having to make a little bit of this or a little bit of that. If you needed to make a batch, you made a full batch, and if you ran out, you made another full batch, because that's just the way things were in the manufacture. Ella rather, shekain balabaya sheish lo nekav bibiras of osmo, that rather the situation of making a small little act of construction is like this. Sometimes a balabayas has to make a little hole if he has a little hole in his mansion, he has to patch it up and fill it in with plaster. That's a tiny act of construction that we're talking about here. And this was what was done in the Mishkan as well. The Mishkan also used to develop holes. How was that? The krushim, which were made out of wood was a very scarce commodity in the desert. So it's not like that if a beam developed a wormhole in it, that you could just go out and get another beam. What they would do is they would seal the hole with molten lead. And so, therefore, even a tiny little hole that you fill is something that was done in the Malachas HaMishkan, and therefore it's a Malacha on Shabbos. Fine. Amar Shmuel. Now, Shmuel and Rav now, I'm sorry. So, Amar Shmuel, HaMitzadeh Yisa Even Chayev. Shmuel says that if a person it does an act of tzidud, which means like this: you take a big stone and you position it in place in order for it to be able to receive other rocks and construction materials on top of it. So just positioning the stone in place, even without adding cement or mortar, is going to make you chayiv, because now you've added it to the construction. So meisvei, so we challenge it and we say echad nos ines ha'even v'echad nos ines hatit hanos ines hatit chayiv. The Brisa says explicitly that if two people are involved in construction, one places the stone and the other adds the mortar, only the person who affixes it with mortar is going to be chayiv, and not the person who just puts it in place. So how can you, Shmuel, tell me that putting a stone in place makes you chayiv? So the Gemara says, V'litai meichem aseifa. But according to that reasoning, use the same brisa that you used to challenge me to challenge yourself. It says, Rabbi Yossi Omer va'afilu hela v'hiniach al gabe dimos shel avonim chayiv. Rabbi Yossi says that even just taking a stone and randomly placing it on top of a wall will make you chayiv if you're adding and augmenting the size of the wall. So the problem is, it seems like there are three different criteria. One is positioning it carefully in place. Another part of the brisa says that you have to actually add mortar to it in order to be chayiv. But this last part of the brisa now says no, that even just adding randomly a stone to augment the size of the wall makes you chayiv even if you didn't position it carefully. So which one is it, says Shmuel? Is it positioning it carefully? Is it positioning it and adding mortar? Or is it not positioning it all and just adding it to a wall? So the Gemara says, Elatzlasi binyani havu. The answer is you have to know construction. Right? There are three different stages of construction when you're building something vertically from the ground up. Tasa metzia v'ila. There's the bottom part, there's the middle part, and the top part. Tasa boit sedudi ve'afra. The bottom part, when you're building a foundation many times does not need to be affixed with mortar, because the weight of the additional materials that you're adding will keep it permanently positioned in its proper place. And therefore, all you need to do is position a rock properly and pack it with dirt, but you don't need to affix it with mortar. You just need to make sure that the engineering is properly positioned, right? But mitzia boino mitina, when you build a wall on top of the foundation, there you taka need mortar, because a wall is not going to stay standing because of the elements and so forth unless it's packed with cement. And then finally, Eloi bahanacha ba'alma. When you want to augment the top of a wall, then just placing stones randomly will also make you chayiv, because there, even though it's not maybe going to remain there permanently, but since it doesn't have to be a weight-bearing a stone, you can loosely place it on top of the wall to fortify the wall, and that in itself is considered to be a malacha. Let's go weiter. Vaha misates. The word misates, we had said, means to square off a stone to prepare it for construction. Misates mishamai mechayiv. So what are you doing when you do an act of misates? So it's a machlokas Rav and Shmuel. Rav amar mishum boina, u'Shmuel amar mishum makeh b'patish. And here we're starting to see a slight differentiation between the act of bona and the act of makeh b'patish. Rav says you're doing an act of construction, and Shmuel says you're doing an act of makeh b'patish. That's the machlokas. They both agree that it's a malacha. The machlokas is what exactly is the malacha. Now, ha'osa nekev belul shel tarnagolim. If you make a hole, if you drill a hole in a chicken coop, so what's the malacha? Rav amar mishum boina, Shmuel amar mishum makeh b'patish. Same machlokas. One says boina, the other one says makeh b'patish. Ayol sufsa b'kufina demara. And the third case is if a person, when you build a hammer, okay, there could be different ways of building a hammer, but generally when you build a hammer, you take the piece of iron and you place it over the hammer handle, and then you need a peg to place it into the hammer in order to be able to affix it, in order to be able to get it to stick. You have to wedge it, right? So when you stick in that peg, you're doing a malacha. But at the machlokas again here is Rav amar mishum boina, Shmuel amar mishum makeh b'patish. That's the machlokas. Utzricha. So now the question is, why did they have to present this machlokas in all three places? Once you know one, you should probably know the other. So the Gemara says no, because the iyashminan kamaisa bahahika amar Rav mishum dederech binyan bekach. If I only had the case of misates, which is preparing a stone for construction, well, that's the normal method of construction. When you're building a building, you have to square off the rocks, the stones that you're using for the wall. So since that's normal construction procedure, that's why Rav says you're chayiv mishum bona. But by drilling a hole in a chicken coop, that's not normally part of the normal protocol of construction. Maybe Rav would agree to Shmuel that it's makeh b'patish and not bona. Now, why would you drill a hole in a chicken coop in the first place? Rashi says, because if you've ever been in a chicken coop, you'd know the reason why. There is such a stench because of the noxious gases that come from the chicken excrement that not only is it stinky, but it could kill the chickens. I mean, there's nitrogen in the air. It can mamish suffocate the chickens. I mean, talk about silent but deadly, right? It's mamish deadly, right? So that's why you drill a hole in order to create a release of the noxious gases in the chicken coop. So that's not a normative act of construction. It's not something you do in every act in a construction site, right? So anyway, so therefore Rav says, no, that too is bona. V'i ashme'inan baha ka'amar Rav mishum dedami labinyan, da'avde la'avira, aval sufsa b'kufina demara dein derech binyan b'kachim emoda leili shmuel. And maybe only in the first two cases does Rav call it boina, because you're dealing with constructs, not with instruments. But maybe when you're building an instrument, maybe Rav would agree that that's not called bona, but rather a makeh b'patish, when you put the peg into the hammer. So therefore, he needs to show in all three cases that it's boina. And v'i ashminun baha ka'amar shmuel aval baha neftarti memoda leila Rav tzricha. And similarly, on the other side, Shmuel has to address all three cases, because if he only addressed the case of the hammer and calls that a makeh b'patish, maybe only there, because it's an instrument and not a construct for construction. But maybe in the other two cases he would agree with Rav that it's bone, and therefore you need all three cases to demonstrate that there's a machlokes. Ba minei Rav Nosson bar Oshia me Rabbi Yochanan, misates mishum mai michayev. He asked Rabbi Yochanan, what malach are you doing when you do an act of misates, of squaring off that stone? So he said to him, ach vilei biyade mishum makeh b'patish. So he just pantomimed for him, and he went like this. He went like this to show that you're doing an act of the final hammer blow. So frek the Gemara v'han and tanan hamasates v'makeh b'patish. But the language of the Mishnah does not imply that. The language of the Mishnah says that masates is one thing and a makeh b'patish is a separate thing. So he explained, he says, Ema hamasates hamakeh b'patish. Take out the vav. It's not that they're two separate things, but that a masates is a makeh b'patish. Toshma, come and listen to the brisa. HaKodeach kol shehu chayim. That if a person drills even a small amount, says the Mishnah, that he's going to be chayiv. Now let me just tell you the difference between we have two verbs for creating a hole, and one is called kodeach and one is called nokev. What is the difference between the two? When you're kodeach, when you drill a hole, your objective is to fill the hole afterwards. When you're nokev, you drill a hole in order to leave a hole. That's the difference between the two. So hakodeach kol shehu chayiv. So the Mishnah says that if you drill a hole with the objective of filling it afterwards, you're chayiv. And presumably it's the same malacha that is being discussed throughout the Mishnah. Now remember, according to Shmuel, the whole theme of the Mishnah is, except for the first one, which is bona, is all makeh v'patish. So bishlam l'Rav mechzi kemand de char churta lebinyana. So according to Rav, who says that everything is bona, then it makes sense why drilling a hole in order to fill it later is an act of construction, because it's like you're drilling a hole in a building, which happens all the time, where you have to drill a hole in order to fill it afterwards. But Elul Shmuel lav gemar malachahu. But according to Shmuel, who says that all things in our Mishnah are makeh v'patish, so why is a kodeach, drilling a hole in order to fill it later, called the final hammer blow? It's clearly not, because your objective is to finish it afterwards by filling it up. So the Gemara answers, Hacha b'mayaskinan debazei beramtza deparzela b'shavke begavei dahainu gemar malacha. That according to Shmuel, the case of drilling a hole in our Mishnah is where you drill a hole with a nail, where you take a nail and you bang it into the wall, leaving a portion of the nail out to use it as a hook. So there, the drilling and the filling of the hole happen simultaneously, and that's why Shmuel would consider it to be makeh b'patish, because the actual drilling is the final hammer blow, because you're filling the hole simultaneous to making it at the same time. And that's the malacha. The malacha, according to Shmuel, is makeh b'patish. And we'll continue this discussion throughout the parak. Have a wonderful day.